Okay, we're looking at Unit 5.1 and 5.2 terms to know. A couple things that we need to know on Unit 1, 5.1, which is called the Enlightenment. First of all, it says on your handout that the Enlightenment, this is a time where we see a focus on reason over tradition. Reason over tradition. And so what they're really looking for as they focus on reason over tradition is that they are going to be able to establish and pursue freedom. They're going to pursue self-determination. And it says on number 1, the ability to challenge kings. The ability to challenge kings. And so we're going to see that, as people develop Enlightenment thinking, they're going to reject just things that they've always been taught about who's in charge, about rights, about government, about science. So the Enlightenment is the focus on reason over tradition. Freedom is a big theme. Self-determination, that's like choosing for yourself what you want, and the ability to challenge kings. Number 2, the Enlightenment grew out of the scientific revolution. And so the Enlightenment is growing out of the scientific revolution. Just as there are natural laws in science, they believed at this time that there should be natural laws that govern the political and social spheres. And so if there's rules of gravity, if there's rules of geometry, there's probably rules to government, there's rules to the political and the social spheres. One example of that is number 3, a guy you should know by name is Francis Bacon, which we've talked about before. And he believed that what we need is something called empiricism. And that's a really important word on your handout. Empiricism is the belief that knowledge comes from what we can observe. And we can observe stuff partly that comes through experiments. This is actually through the scientific method. We have experiments that we set up, and it's through the scientific method rather than just religion or tradition. So it doesn't really matter like, okay, well, you've already been taught something. The question is there a way that you can observe that it's true? And an example of this traditional practice that would not pass the test of the scientific method is bloodletting. They used to believe that if you were sick, it's probably because you had like too much blood, they would argue. So that's Francis Bacon. Number 4, another Enlightenment thinker you should know is a guy named John Locke. That's Locke. And John Locke, he challenged the traditional way people understood government. And so if Francis Bacon is dealing with like science and medicine, John Locke is dealing with what people believed about government. And one of the things about that was number 5, a popular European theory of government had been the concept of something we've talked about before called the divine right of kings. And we remember that the divine right of kings is this idea that you are put in charge by God. And if God put you on the throne, it doesn't really matter what people say or what people believe or what people think. The most important thing is that you're really just accountable to God and not to what people believe about you. And John Locke did not agree with that. It says in number 6, Enlightenment reasoning led Locke to believe that citizens are in you'll write down social contract with their leaders, a social contract with their leaders. We, in this contract, we actually give up certain rights in exchange for government protection. So just like any other contract, you have a cell phone contract, you give money in exchange for services, but if they don't give you services, you're probably going to change your contract. So John Locke said we are in a social contract with our leaders. We give up certain rights in exchange for government protections. And if we do not get those protections when we give up our rights, then it's our right and our responsibility for us to, you'll write down, rebel. A guy we didn't really talk too much about, but he was actually in the PDF files, and so you're accountable, is this guy named Baron Montesquieu. And he was another Enlightenment thinker, and he argued for something we have talked about called separation of powers. Like in our government in the United States, we have separation of powers. We have a judicial, we have a legislative, we have an executive branch. This allows for, you'll write down checks and balances. Checks and balances means that our president can't do whatever he wants. He has to actually have compromise with the other branches of government. So that is an Enlightenment thought that we have in our government to this day. Number 8, one important Enlightenment thinker who challenged the traditional way people thought about economics was a guy named Adam Smith. So we've talked about science with Francis Bacon. We talked about government with John Locke, and now for economics, which has to do with like money, we're talking about Adam Smith. And during this time, number 9, regarding trade and colonies, European powers traditionally saw their colonies really as just a way to make as much money as possible. And they actually had many rules and regulations on who businesses could sell to. Mainly, you could really only sell to your mother country. You would sell them your raw materials, and you'd have to buy from them their finished goods. And this system, where you have to buy from your mother country and there's rules and regulations, that system is something called mercantilism. And that's going to be something that I'm there for you to take a look at. That is mercantilism. It's the system where you have to buy and sell from your mother country. Well, instead of this system, Adam Smith argued for something called laissez-faire economics, which in French means like leave it alone or let it be. And this called for little, or you'll write down no government role, little or no government role in rules and regulation. In other words, they wanted really not the government to get involved. They believed that it'd just really be best if government wasn't a part of it. Laissez-faire, just leave us alone, everything will be fine. And number 11, he argued that even without government rules, the market would actually create what's called you'll write down, invisible hand. Like not a hand that you can see, like the government having a bunch of rules, that's a visible hand, but there is actually an invisible hand that would guide the market to make good products at a competitive price. Because if you run a restaurant that's dirty, if you run a restaurant that's not good, that restaurant's not going to last. It's going to close. Or if you charge way too much money for your product, then you're not going to be able to stay in business. Those are things that are an invisible hand, kind of making sure that things aren't just crazy. And so you don't have to worry that the government's not having 1,000 rules and regulations, Adam Smith says. Number 12, Adam Smith is describing something that we have today. He's describing a view of, you'll write down, the free market, of free market capitalism. It's called free market because you're free to make a business, free to choose how much you're going to charge, free to decide who you're going to sell to, who you're going to buy from. This is free market capitalism. And his argument for this is in his 1776 book called The Wealth of Nations. It's called The Wealth of Nations. So that's that. Number 13, in capitalism, which is something Adam Smith believed in, factories and businesses are, you'll write down, owned privately. They are owned privately by individuals, and we are running these privately owned businesses. They're owned by individuals, just by regular people like you and me, and we're doing it for the purpose of getting a profit. And it says on your handout, it is not owned / controlled by the government. So we don't want the government in charge. We don't want the government owning businesses. Actually, it'd be better if we did it all by ourselves. So not only do we see the Enlightenment re-examine science with Bacon, government with Adam Smith, economics, government with John Locke, economics with Adam Smith, we also see the re-examining of beliefs about, you'll write down God for number 14. So they're re-examining the belief about God. And for 15, some thinkers argued, number 15, for something called deism. I'll write it here for you real quickly. Deism. And this is the belief that said God did not perform miracles. Like God is not involved in miracles. He's not doing any of those types of things anymore. And actually, deism is this view that compares God to kind of like a clockmaker, actually, like a person who designs and created the universe, but you'll write down has since walked away. And so just like if you dropped your watch or you cracked your phone screen, there was an engineer who made your phone, but that engineer is not gonna like respond or care that you broke your phone. And in the same way, a god of deism exists. He made the world, he made the universe, but he doesn't care if your life is broken. He has walked away. And number 16, one of the most famous deists of all times, includes Thomas Jefferson, who actually edited a version of the Bible and took out all miracles. He said, we know miracles don't happen. We know Jesus can't heal. He can't rise from the dead. And so he creates his own version of the Bible where he takes out all miracles. Number 17. One intellectual who demonstrated that books were in some ways as important as bullets in the forming of the American Revolution. This thinker actually gave reasons why Americans should be willing to fight for their independence. This author, his name is Thomas Paine, he wrote a book you should all know by name called Common Sense. And this is a really good example that it's books as well as bullets that help make the American Revolution possible. Number 18, the Enlightenment was not the first movement of European intellectuals. It's not like we wait for the 16 and the 1700s for Europeans to start thinking about these types of like big issues, because it turns out Europeans have been thinking like about intellectual issues and areas before. So this is not the first time. And one of the things that we see is that when we look at this, we actually see this goes all the way back, all the way back. One of the first intellectual movements was by European intellectuals during the Middle Ages, you'll write down. And they believed in the Middle Ages that faith and reason actually went together, is what they said. Faith and reason went together. And they were led by intellectuals like Thomas Aquinas, whose name is underlined, and a group of people that we refer to as the scholastics. And you may have gone to a scholastic book fair when you were younger. It's named after these mainly Catholic priests, actually, who believed that science and faith went together, that you should read and study, and that actually makes you a better Christian. Now, number 19, non-religious, like people that were intellectuals also, but not religious at all, are this group of people. They don't really have a overwhelming religious focus. Number 19, these intellectuals believe that reason and science could lead to, you'll write down, near perfect communities. So some people thought, well, we're making all this progress in science, all this progress in economics. I bet we could probably, if we applied reason and science to living in cities, we could pretty much have like almost perfect places to live. And these movements, we call them utopian socialism. Utopian socialism. And number 20, there's a couple of guys you should know who are leaders in utopian socialism. People like Saint Simon, Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, and they actually experimented with communes. A commune is like where you have people living in a city that you made like from scratch, like out in the woods, in the forest, and you're like all gonna like say we're all in this together. We're not gonna like have rich or poor. We're all equal. And these communes will write down would actually have no private property or money. No private property or money. They thought money's the problem, private property's the problem. Get rid of this and we'll have like these perfect towns. Well, 21, these utopian socialists will write down for 21 wanted to eliminate the inequality between rich and poor. And like these socialists saw that there's poor people struggling, rich people who are doing great, and they thought that wasn't okay. And they wanted to eliminate the inequality between rich people and poor people. Unfortunately, some of them actually saw the blame of poverty in the hands of one particular ethnic group. You'll write down for the end of 21 that would actually be the Jews who were blamed by some of these utopian socialists for the cause of problems. Number 22, of course, when you have a society with no money and no private property, and you're living in a commune and everyone promises to do their best, kind of like a group project, you can kind of guess that number 22, these communes, these like communal living areas, these towns they made from scratch, they generally failed in a few years, so they were not successful. Number 23, one early leader of feminism was this woman, Mary Wollstonecraft, and she's super famous because she wrote a book called Vindication of the Rights of Women. It was called Vindication of the Rights of Women. And she, as a feminist, believed that the only reason that some girls were not as intellectually uh, advanced as men had nothing to do with women not being able to do it, nothing to do with men being smarter. In her book, Vindication of the Rights of Women, she said that the only reason women were not equal with men is that they had not been given the same educational opportunities. And so she believed if we had given them the same educational opportunities, I would bet women would do just as well as men. And women gathered to discuss their fight for their vote, to discuss the right to be heard and take jobs and go to school. And number 25, women gathered in 1848 to argue for women's rights at something we call the Seneca Falls Convention. And this is a super important meeting. Seneca Falls Convention. And there at Seneca Falls, they discuss these goals they have of early feminism. Number 26, we also see the movement to end slavery in the 19th century. Of course, for our country, we fight the Civil War. If you don't know, there's a Civil War, the North versus the South, after Abraham Lincoln is elected president of the United States as the first Republican. The Southern states secede, they leave because they believe that they have the right to define slavery for themselves. And this war ultimately becomes a war to end slavery, which is something the North wins. It causes Abraham Lincoln to be assassinated, the first president to be assassinated over this issue of slavery ultimately. And that movement to end slavery is called abolitionism. Abolitionism. It's the move to end slavery, and it grows not just in the United States but all around the world. The last country to get rid of slavery is Brazil, and they wait till 1888. So that's a ways to go. Number 28, we also see 28 that some Jews felt that they could only really be safe by returning to the Middle East. You might remember that Jews originally, their ancestral homeland is in the Middle East. If you open up the Bible, those Bible stories take place in Israel, which is in the Middle East. And Jews have been scattered everywhere for 2,000 years, being persecuted, and they felt they weren't treated right. And this desire to return to build a new nation of Israel is something we call Zionism, and it's a proper noun. And it's this belief that, you know what, I think in the Bible, God has um, God has given us the land of Israel, and I think it's ours forever. And so in the 19th century, you see Jews returning to Israel, trying to reclaim what they thought was theirs. But there's a problem. Number 29, the main obstacle to Zionism is that while most Jews, and you might remember there's two types of Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, these are mainly European Jews, and Sephardic Jews, These are Middle Eastern Jews and Spanish Jews. They were in diaspora in the Holy Land, which had been occupied by Arab Muslims who claimed the same land. So this is a problem that we have. We have Jews wanting the Holy Land, and there are people already living there. Number 30, Unit 5.2, Thomas Jefferson, he writes, of course, the Declaration of Independence, and he borrows the idea of something we call unalienable rights. And this idea of unalienable rights, these are rights that no one can take away from you. He gets these from John Locke. John Locke said there's three unalienable rights: life, liberty, property. Jefferson says it's life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, but he's copying something that he believed in because of John Locke's influence in his life. That's going to be important because other people are thinking about the same thing, like in France. Number 31, French society was divided up into three estates. These are like three classes. The first estate is the priest, second estate is the nobility, and the third estate is everyone else. And 32, during this time, you have King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette living lavishly in his palace, which is a place we've talked about before called Versailles. And Versailles, number 33, was a palace that was a symbol of this type of government. There's a type of government where you can do whatever you want. There's no limitations, and that type of government is called absolutism. And absolutism was the type of government that they had. Number 34, King Louis worsened France's economic troubles by financing the American Revolution. He didn't really have money for that, but he spent it, and that like really hurt France's economy because they were blowing the budget on something they did not have. So to solve that problem, 35, the Estates General voted to raise taxes on the Third Estate. And that's a huge problem because the Third Estate was like 97% of the country that felt they were being taken advantage of by the First and Second Estate. Number 36, now the Third Estate is not just poor people, it is poor people, but it's also among a group of people called the bourgeoisie, who are also known as you'll write down for 36, the middle class. They're the middle class, the bourgeoisie. So they're educated, they're rich, but they're not born rich. They're rich because they were actually worked their way into their wealth. And 37, there's some good news about the French Revolution. They argued for basic human rights in a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And they're kind of arguing that we all have these human rights and that governments should safeguard that. Well, number 38, King Louis was not really interested in becoming what was called a constitutional monarchy. That's a government where there is a king and queen, but they have to listen to to rules over them, like documents or like a group of people. And that's actually, we see an example of that in Europe, in Britain. And so they did not want to submit to a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy like Britain. You'll write down the blank. And France entered a period of violence, actually. Sadly, they killed people that were perceived to be political opponents, or you weren't revolutionary enough, and there was the de-Christianization of France. They made crosses and bells illegal. They got rid of or altered chess and cards. They changed names of streets and babies. And they even closed down the Church of Notre Dame to make it into the Temple of Reason. And all of this has a name. This time of killing and change. It's called the Reign of Terror, like the rule of terror, the Reign of Terror. And number 39, this Reign of Terror ended when there was a charismatic general who had really great personal skills, and he actually was so popular that he was able to declare himself Emperor of France. This guy, you should know, he is none other than Napoleon. And you might remember that he crowned himself, meaning that he believed he was higher and above even the role of the church. Number 40, just as the American Revolution led to the French Revolution leads to the Haitian Revolution, number 40. Haitian society is divided among a group of different people. There's Grand Blancs, who are wealthy whites who own property. The word Grand Blancs means great whites. There's also Petite Blancs. These are little whites who were white but did not own slaves, and that's what they really wanted, and they thought that would be important for them to achieve that status. And there's also an interesting group called the gens de couleur, and these are black Haitians who owned slaves themselves, and they thought the problem was the white people on the island who owned slaves. They wanted alone to own slaves, and on the bottom of Haitian society were the enslaved Africans, of course. So that's Haitian society. You can see that it's ripe for revolution. Number 41, the Haitian Revolution was led by Toussaint Louverture. This is a Haitian who is going to lead the revolution, and he's actually inspired by the same thing as Jefferson and the French, and he's inspired by the Enlightenment, And so that's the same inspiration. Number 42, Haiti was the first country in Latin America to get independence. We're going to see many countries in Latin America get independence, but Haiti's the first one. And it's also the first black-led country in the Western Hemisphere. The first black-led country in the Western Hemisphere, which is a result of their hard work and fighting, even as the French send thousands of soldiers to subdue them. Black bravery and leadership gives this Haiti its independence. We also see it was the only country to become permanently independent as a result of a slave uprising. Usually slave uprisings result in the death of thousands of enslaved people. This was successful, even if they had challenges in creating a lasting democracy. They struggle financially. They have to pay back France for the cost of the war. Haiti has a very difficult road ahead of them, but they still nonetheless are a black-led government and the first really successful slave revolution in world history. So that's noteworthy for sure. Number 43, in the rest of Latin America, like South America and Mexico, we see types of revolutions called Creole Revolutions. And these Creole Revolutions wanted to challenge the power of whites in Latin America who were from Spain, because in most of Latin America, the most important people in Latin America were called peninsulares, and these were white people born on the Iberian Peninsula. That's like where Spain and Portugal were, and like that was like you got the best jobs, the best opportunities if you're white, born in Spain. And 44, the Creoles, they're the second most important people in Latin American society. These were whites born in Latin America. And so the Peninsulares were white people born in Spain. The Creoles were whites born in Latin America, and they did have influence over the mixed race people. You might remember there's two groups of mixed race people. One group is called the Mestizos. These are people whose background is mixed. They are Native American, and they are Spanish. Most Mexican Americans are mestizo. You have a Spanish last name like Lopez, Rodriguez, Chavez, and you have darker skin from your Native American ancestry. You also have mulattoes who are half black, half white. And so the Creoles have influence over these two groups. And they had really at first no interest in ending slavery. That wasn't like something that they were really interested in. 45, the main leader of the Creole Revolutions was Simone Bolivar. This guy is a Creole, and he, of course, at first wasn't for getting rid of slavery at all. He was also inspired by the Enlightenment. And eventually though he's inspired by the Enlightenment, he eventually decides to free slaves to basically get them to join his army, not because he like really loves or cares for like the abolition movement. He writes a document kind of explaining his arguments for what he believes. It's called the Jamaica Letter. And in this letter, he argued that humans have natural rights given to us by God. So all of us have natural rights And this is just like John Locke. This is just like Thomas Jefferson. This is just like the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the Jamaica Letter. His document, Simone Bolivar's document, says we have natural rights given to us by God. 47, because Latin America had limited practice with democracy, like the Spanish never allowed them like to vote. They never had like a house of burgesses like the English did. They were very susceptible to a group of people we call personalist leaders. And these are people who are like so popular that their popularity allows them to get away with things that you probably shouldn't. Personalist leaders were people who could bend or even break the law. But it's not just Latin American leaders who bend or break the law. We in the United States have a good example of a popular personalist leader. This would be Andrew Jackson, who, even though he did some good stuff, like allowed all people to vote who were male, regardless of property, he did, of course, argue and push for the Trail of Tears ultimately. And even though the Supreme Court said you can't really like support that, he did it anyway. And so that's an example of a popular general doing whatever he wanted. And we see a lot of that, sadly, in Latin American history. Those are called personalist leaders. Napoleon would be an example of a personalist leader. 48, in the 19th century, we also saw a rise in intense pride in your culture or ethnic identity. Whenever you have that, this is a movement known as, you'll write down, nationalism for 48. Nationalism brought some regions together for the first time, like Italy and Germany. We never saw an Italy or a Germany before. Germany is so into this idea of a Germany that they actually go to war with France. You might remember there was a border region called Alsace-Lorraine, a part of France that spoke German. And so they invaded and took it. And they said, we are just actually liberating this part of France who speaks German. It just really belongs with us. At number 15, nationalism also threatened to tear other parts apart: Austria, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia. These are multi-ethnic empires, and because they're multi-ethnic, what happens if the people in these empires want their own country? These empires will not last. Looking for opportunities, millions of Italians in the 1800s migrated to the US or to this other country where they had opportunities. That would be Argentina. At 52, lastly, in slow decline, the Ottoman Empire sometimes had a nickname. It was called the Sick Man of Europe because it was getting smaller and smaller. It was breaking up. Parts were getting freedom. They decided to focus on their Turkish identity. They discriminated against people like the Kurds, and they tried to, you'll write down, modernize. Like they wanted to modernize. They wanted to be more like Europe, which is a theme that we'll be talking about more in the days and weeks to come. And with that, that brings us to the end of our review.